Good day and welcome to Survival Crafts. This is a show where we share some how-tos in the world of traditional skills, survival, bushcraft, and prepping. This is show number 6 and I'm your host, Brenda Holder. Well, I'm really pleased this week because it's finally my turn. I'm going to be showing you in this video some helpful sewing tools, some useful tips for sewing with sinew onto hide, a few different stitching techniques, some cool ways to tie knots onto the end of thread or sinew, and how to add more sinew onto the middle of your project if you run out of sewing thread. This video is also going to help you out in later shows, in shows number 10, 11, and 12, where I'm going to be showing you how to make the world's easiest hide jacket. And of course, later videos I'll be doing things like moccasins and a hide vest and other projects that you won't want to miss. So stay tuned and let's get started. Okay, so welcome back, and this week we're going to be doing some foundation work on sewing with hide and leather. This is really important because in later videos I'm going to be showing you how to do some specific crafts, and it's really good to have an understanding of how to actually work with the leather or the hide, how to sew with it. So in this video we're going to be learning about how to actually sew on the hide itself, how to sew it together, how to make it so your seams are invisible basically. And then the next 2 videos after this we're going to be focusing on how to put beads onto hide. So just to show you what you can actually do with this, let's have a look at some crafts that I've made. And so we've got a little mini moccasin, which is pretty simple to make, and I'm going to be showing you how to do this in a later video. The hide jacket that I'm wearing is one that I've made. Now this is actually a very easy jacket to make. The pattern is very, very simple. It just takes a long time to do it. So in videos 10, 11, and 12, I'm going to show you a slightly different pattern. It's very similar to this, but it's slightly different and much simpler. In fact, when I came across it, I was pretty floored at how easy it really was. I'm not a seamstress, but finding something where there was a pattern that I didn't have to go and buy was pretty cool to me. So you can look forward to those. And then finally, these are some moccasins. In fact, these are the very first pair of moccasins that I made. Lots and lots of mistakes that I made in here. Even though they turned out very nicely, there were things that I could have actually done differently. So you'll actually see a very similar method that we use when we do make the mini moccasins. I'm not going to be doing full-size moccasins on any of the videos. It's just a little bit too complex to try and take people through that process. Before we get started, let's pan down and take a look at some of the tools you're going to need to work with. Okay, let's take a look at what we're going to need to create this project. You are going to need just some scrap pieces of hide. And this can even be fabric, the tougher the better, just so you get the feel of it, but anything will do if you don't have leather or hide hanging around. Some good quality scissors. I like to use my Fiskars. These are really great for working with hide. They do cut through it well. You want some sinew or some other type of thread, maybe a nymo if you're just working with fabric. You will need a glover's needle, a thimble, or if you have one, a Sailmakers Plum. And don't worry, I'm going to be showing you what this is all about in a few minutes. And of course, finally, a little pair of pliers, or a big pair, whatever you like. This always makes it easier to pull a needle through hide when it's stuck, because the eyes are pretty big. And before we actually start sewing, I'm going to talk about these different tools we'll be working with. So having an understanding of how they work really makes things a whole lot better. So pause the video, go gather up all your materials, and we'll learn a few ways on how to sew hide after we talk about the tools. Okay, this is false sinew. Typically this is used most commonly because it's pretty easy to get, and it comes in all different colors and sized spools. And it also has a variety of colors to match different colored commercial tanned hides. And it's like thick dental floss, and it's super strong. And I like to use this for sewing all of my projects. I don't use real sinew because it's pretty labor intensive and you need quite a lot to sew a pair of moccasins or do a project. So we save that for our bows and other tools that we'll use. Lots of people will actually use dental floss as well. I haven't tried it, but I can understand the appeal to it. However, I think that this is an awful lot cheaper to use than dental floss. Dental floss, you're looking at $2 to $3 for, I don't know, 25 yards. And that's not likely going to work on a full set of moccasins, and it definitely won't be enough for a jacket. But if you take a look at these big rolls of sinew, this little one has lasted me about 9 years, and you can see from the one beside it, which is a brand new one, that you get a lot of bang for your buck. And one of the reasons for that is because you actually need to split the sinew. And you would probably split it into 4 or 5 strands, and I'll show you how to do that in just a moment. But what that means is if I'm splitting this into 4 or 5 strands, then this one roll actually will give me 4 to 5 times more than what the actual roll will itself. So it's $25 for this. You can see that's going to be way better than any dental floss in terms of cheapness. All right, so in a moment, let's get in nice and close, and I'll show you how to split the sinew. Okay, so before we can sew, we have to thin out the sinew by thinning it. If we use it at this full width, you can see it's pretty bulky, and it makes it pretty difficult to also pull the needle through your hide with all of this bulk. And if you take a look at the eye of the needle as well, there's no way that's going to fit through there, so you do have to split it. So usually I use a full arm span of this, but today I'm just working with a small piece just so we can stay in camera easier. So here's how to split the sinew. I usually start in the center of the sinew rather than on the edge. You could do it there. I just find it's easier to find the natural splitting place if you're in the center of it. And if you just start pulling, you'll see there's all of this fiber coming off. So I just find where there's no fiber coming off anymore, and that's where the natural split will happen. The good thing about it being sinew is all I got to do is tug on it and all those little fibers go back in place. So I'm going to just pull the sinew apart. And I said earlier you can get at least 4 or 5 splits out of this. So it gives you an awful lot of sinew to work with. Now right now I'm having a relatively easy time splitting my sinew, but if this were an arm length, then I would probably have a much more challenging time to split it. Just because of the way that it's woven together, it can tangle up pretty easy. The way I like to solve that is I'll have somebody hold one end of the sinew while I pull and split on it, and it stops it from tangling up. Okay, so let's have a little close-up on how to thread this needle. So this is actually fairly easy to thread sinew into a glover's needle because the eye of the needle is pretty big, and in fact I can quite easily just push it through like that. However, some glover's needles, the eye is a little smaller, so you might want to give this a little bit of a twist. And there's always a little trick to putting sinew or thread onto a needle, and that is you want to get as little thread showing between your fingers as possible, and you actually will bring the needle to the thread rather than the thread to the needle and pull through. When I sew, there's no need to double the thread because this is very strong. All you need to do is have just one length of sinew to work with. And then here, I just leave a little tail hanging. And then that way, as I'm sewing and using up all this thread, I just have to tug on the needle so I can get more sinew until I've got a very short tail, and then I'll have to tie it off. Okay, so that's the sinew. And the other piece of the puzzle here, so to speak, is the glover's needle. Now I'm going to grab another little needle here so I can show you. These are made specifically to go through leather. Now I'm going to have the camera pan down nice and close to this needle right here. And you can actually see, if I spin it slowly, if I slowly turn it, if I can get my fingers to cooperate, that sinew's in my way, you can see right on the edge here there's 3 blades. And those 3 blades are very, very sharp. Sometimes sewing through the leather is very tough, even when you do have a really sharp needle. And you might have some difficulty in going through the hide. Remember, I did say that you're going to be sewing through 3 strips of leather. And again, I'll explain that in a few minutes. But it's very difficult, especially if you've got a commercially tanned hide like this one is. And so inserting the needle through 3 thicknesses might be difficult, as well as pulling it out. If you know that you have a very sharp needle, but you still find it difficult to go through all the layers, you can use a thimble. And I like this thimble here. It's got a hardened rubber, and I've slipped that hardened rubber over top of a metal thimble. I don't like to use this metal thimble on its own because at times I found that the needle will just slip out even with the little divots that you find in it. Metal on metal is still pretty slippery. So I covered it with this rubberized thimble here. And I don't use the rubberized thimble by itself either because the glovers are so sharp that even on the back end right here, they can penetrate this rubberized thimble, and there's actually little holes all through this. But I do find that the combination of both of these is ideal for me. So the rubber stops the needle from slipping, and the metal underneath stops me from getting punctured by the needle. But there are times when I prefer to use this, and this is called a Sailmakers Plum. It was kindly given to me by our friend Jed when I had made him some moccasins. I was pushing so hard on the needle, this end ended up penetrating my thumb. So he kindly gave me this, and it is my preferred method when I'm working with very difficult hide. I'm not going to demonstrate it now just because it's something that takes a little while for me to put together. Now sometimes you might find it difficult to pull your needle through the hide because again, this eye is a very big one, and when you find yourself in that situation, then I'll just do a quick demonstration just through one layer. So what people tend to do is they will pull their needle right to where the eye is until it gets stuck, and then they'll keep pulling and pulling and pulling. And that's not very effective because it's just stuck there. What I'll do is push the needle back a little bit more, and then with a quick snapping motion, I can pull it through. Now sometimes that's not going to work so well. So of course, if that happens, then I will just simply use a pair of pliers and do the same motion, just quick snap through. And that is the thing that will always get it to go through the hide. Okay, so those are some of the tools that we can work with. And let's cut to another scene a little close up where I can show you how to work with what is called a welt. Okay, so what is a welt? It's something that's used in hide sewing projects, everything from beaded bags to moccasins to jackets. So what is it? Well, it's a piece of hide that is sewn between the seams of a project, and it has two very important functions. So first of all, it actually adds a lot of structural integrity to the stitching as well as the project itself. And it also, if I flip this over, this is my beaded jacket I was wearing. You can see here, this is where the stitch line is. And what the welt does is it actually gives the sinew and the needle some more padding to actually bite into, which will help create some more stability. And it also helps to keep those stitches hidden. As you can see here, you can see the welt, but you can't see any stitching on there at all. All right, well, let's pan out so I can show you a little better what that would look like. So if I'm sewing two seams together, whether it's a sleeve or a jacket, and I've got my two pieces there, I also want to have my welt. And the welt has to sit in between those two seams. And you'll notice that this is actually quite wide, whereas the welt that I showed you was cut close to the jacket. I'm going to do a few stitches in a couple of minutes and stitch this welt into here, and then I'll show you how I get that look. But essentially, I want to make sure that this welt sits flush with both seams. So when I sew it, and remember, this is the inside of the jacket, this will be the outside, what people will actually see when you wear. So it's important to start with the inside here. So that's how I'm going to start sewing in a minute. And let's take a look and see how I would sew that together. Now, whether I use a welt or not, the sewing stitches that I'm going to use are identical. I'm going to show you two different styles of stitching. I'm going to show you the blanket stitch, and I'm also going to show you the whip stitch. They're both used. My favorite one is the blanket stitch, and I'll explain why in a moment. But basically, when we're sewing our seams together, so this will be the inside of the jacket. You might have your pen marks on it from where you've traced your pattern out, and then when you turn it the right way around, you'll see it will all look beautiful. So we're going to put the welt directly in between those two pieces of hide, making sure that they are completely even, and remembering that this welt here is going to get trimmed down later. And you want to have your welt in between your whole seam line of your project. What you'll notice is as you sew, especially if you've got a long sleeve or a long seam, is that this welt will just kind of fall down. And that's okay, because as you're sewing, you'll just pull that welt back up so it's even. So everything that you've already sewn is already even, so it's nothing to worry about, and it's very easy to just keep pulling that welt up as you work. Okay, so let's take a look at how we want to sew this together. Before we do, I'm going to show you two different knot techniques today. And the first one is one that I like to use especially with moccasins. I like to build the knot right into my project. And the reason I do that with moccasins is because this type of knot will be much less harsh on your foot. If you have a big, huge knot here, it can really rub on your toes, or especially in the underarm parts of a jacket as well. So I don't start out with a knot. I'm just simply going to put my needle in. There we go. So needle's going to go in, and I'll pull through. And I just want a little bit of my sinew left here. And all I'm going to do is I'm just going to tie a thumb knot here. I'm pretty sure everybody knows how to do that. So I'll tie a little thumb knot, and I want the thumb knot on top of the seam if I possibly can. And I'll do it as a double thumb knot. That makes it much more secure. Now those of you who know knots, I can feel you all cringing right now, but have no fear. This is all going to work out really nicely, I promise. Because what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to sew in that loose little tail. So let's take a look at the blanket stitch. So I've got my first stitch in. And when I'm stitching, I want to make sure that my stitches are just a couple of millimeters below the top edge. Now I don't want them so close that they're going to break through, because they will, even though it's hide, they can break out of there. I want them low enough that it is not going to break through the top, but I don't want it so low that it's going to create too big of a seam allowance and make your moccasin fit too small. So the other thing I want to pay attention to is how close together I put my stitches. I want to make sure that they're actually as close together as I possibly can put them. So I want them down a few millimeters from the top, and I want them a couple millimeters apart. So I'm going to stick a pair of glasses on so I can actually see what I'm doing here. And I will show you how this is done. So that loose tail sits along the top edge there, right on top of the welt that I'm going to be sewing in. I want to have one final look to make sure my welt is up even where I want it to be. Now, I'm always going to be going in to the fabric or the leather in the same side every time. I'm not going to be doing any back and forth. It's always the same spot. So I'm going to come in from the front again, push my needle through to the back, all the way through, and pull. And I'm going to keep pulling until I'm left with a little loop here. And then I'm going to take my needle through the loop, and I'm going to just simply pull. And let's see that one more time. So you'll notice that the tail is getting trapped underneath those. So let's do that again. Needle in the same side, we're not changing sides, push through, and you can see that it's about equal on both sides here. I'm going to push all the way through, keep pulling, and then I've got that little loop there. Let's make that a bit smaller. And it doesn't matter which side of the loop I go in. It doesn't really matter. I can change every time if I feel like it. But for me, I just go in through the back, pull, and there the stitch is going in. I've actually had people tell me and not believe that I have sewn my stuff because it looks machine stitched, but it's not. It really is stitched by hand. So that is the blanket stitch. Goes in, the needle goes in one side, pull. And before you pull it tight, make sure your needle goes through the little loop. Pull that tight, and away we go. So it's quite an easy stitch to do. And what happens when you're sewing is that this will also end up laying down on top of the welt. And it might be a little bit difficult to see. That's not just the tail that's trapped in there, that's also this. And what that does is it gives integrity and strength right along the whole top edge here. It really binds it nicely. Now I'm going to continue on, but this time I'm going to just do a whip stitch. And this is something that a lot of people are very familiar with, and lots of people prefer it. So if you're one of those people and that's your preference, great, that's the way you should sew. With the whip stitch, everything is the same except there's no loop. We want the stitches down the same distance from the top as the blanket stitch, and we also want them nice and close together. Here's the difference. Just like the blanket stitch, the needle goes in the same way, but this time we just pull. Once again, goes in and just pull. And I'll do a few more stitches and you'll see a slight difference in them. Now I think the whip stitch is probably every bit as good as the blanket stitch from what I understand, but I just find that having that extra top layer there makes it look a little bit more sturdy. And I'm going to just tug up on this welt again, make sure that it stays where I want it to be. And I'll do just a couple more whip stitches. Now there's nothing that's going to lay down along the top of this whip stitch. It's all going to just, you can see, if you look carefully, you can see the whip stitches are kind of going off in a slanted direction, and you can see the blanket stitches are much more straight up and down. So let's put in one more stitch. And now you can actually see there's our welt. So I'm going to cut the welt. You want to really trim nice and close to your project, and you'll get that same welt that you got or that you saw on my jacket. So it's fairly flush with this, and it creates kind of a nice look there. Okay, so sometimes when you're working with a very large project, such as a jacket, you'll have a long sleeve and a long side seam, and that's basically one big long stitching project from the outer edge of the sleeve all the way into the armpit and all the way down the side. So that's a long seam to sew, and you're going to run out of thread. So I'm going to cut this one short. We'll just pretend that I've run out of thread here, or out of sinew. And we're going to need to add more. So there's a couple of things that I like to do. So I will just tie a knot, just again a thumb knot, as close down onto that seam as I can. It's a little bit hard doing this in a really tiny little camera frame, but I'll get it. So basically I'm just tying a knot, just a double thumb knot, and just tying that on. And I'm going to do the same thing that I did at the very beginning of the project, except I'm going to trim my ends a little bit, and this time instead of putting one tail down along the seam line, I'm going to have two tails to go down along the seam line. And it doesn't make any difference. You won't notice anything bulky. So again, I'm just going to, maybe I'll tighten those two knots up so they're right up against the seam there. I'm going to pull them and lay them along the seam. And I can just continue as though I was still using the same piece of sinew. Sometimes, because you've tied two pieces together, it's a little bit difficult. I'll get my scissors out of my way so they don't go flying. And I'll continue on with a blanket stitch on here. So that's how to add more sinew. And I need to show you a few more things in terms of how to sew with the hide. One of the things I get asked commonly then, once people have finished their first moccasin seam, is, okay, now how do I finish this? How do I tie off? It's not that difficult. I'm going to just get rid of these two little tails. We'll pretend they're well sewn in. So it's not that difficult. When you come to the very end of a seam, when you're ready to finish off your project, you're going to you put in your last stitch, and you can just go through that loop once, twice, and that will get you ready to put your knot in there. So that's already one knot put in. I like to tie a couple knots, so I'm simply going to take my needle and I'm going to go right underneath that little thread bridge that I just laid down. I'm going to pull and create my loop, And so my needle will go through there. And again, it doesn't matter what side I go in, this way or this way. So that will be my second knot. And if it's moccasins, I do like to put in a third. Just want to be sure. And there's my third knot. Now, when I cut it, I don't want to cut it really short. I never cut close to a knot. I like to cut a little bit away. And then the other thing that you can do, which is really a good idea, is take a lighter and burn that down so you create this little molten ball. I want to show you one other thing to do. And this will be very helpful, especially when we learn how to do beaded projects. Because you're not always going to be starting on a seam, and you can't always just kind of tie there. Sometimes you might be starting in the middle of a project, and you need to have a knot on your thread before you start in the middle of a project. So I'm going to show you a really interesting way that I like to tie knots. This method can sometimes really confuse people. I'm not sure why. I personally find it a very, very easy way to tie knots, but I show this to people and they end up scratching their heads a little bit. So I'll show you. Keep in mind, this is one way to tie a knot at the end of a thread. If you have a different way that you prefer, that's great. Use that. But let me demonstrate my cool. There's the end of the thread, the tail end, the long end. There's my little short tail here. We're not going to touch that or do anything with it. In fact, let me just pull that tail in a little bit closer. All I need to have in my hands is my needle and the very end of the long end of my tail. I'm going to take that tail and I'm going to lay it across like a T, not along my needle, but I'm going to make a cross on my T. I'm then going to bring that underneath my thumb and I'm going to pinch it between my thumb and forefinger and hold it. I'm then going to take the long end of the tail and I'm going to wrap it about 4 times around the needle, or maybe 5. Now I'm going to hold on to this and I'm going to pull it down underneath my thumb and forefinger so the whole wound bit is underneath my thumb and forefinger. I'm going to pinch that, and now I'm going to pull my needle away and I'm going to just keep pulling until I form a knot. So it's a very easy way to make a nice big knot at the end of your project. So if I have to sew somewhere in the middle, that's a nice big knot that won't come out of my hide. Okay, well that wraps up the sewing section. A little bit dry. I'm not all that crazy about sitting in a sewing class myself, but it's really important to get those foundations and those basics so you know what you're doing, because the better you get at it and the more practiced you get and the more comfortable you are with it, then you can do stuff like this. And as I said earlier, I'm really not a seamstress, but I had to learn because this was the kind of stuff within my culture and my traditions. It was very important for me to learn how to do these things. And so I did take that time out. And remember, next time it'll be a little more fun because we're going to be playing with beads, and I'll be showing you how to put beads onto your hide. Have a good day. Well, I hope you found that video useful and you now are an expert sewer using sinew on hide. Until next time, thank you so much for watching, and remember, if you like what we do, please subscribe. Give us a like, make some comments in the box down below. You can post this on your own website or share it on Facebook. We're always happy when you share this with your friends. If you think that there's a project that you believe we could actually make, please send us a message and we'll see if we can make that happen for you. Until next time, we'll see you on the next video.